I want to thank all of you for being here and a warm congratulations on having your child here at Stanford. I will tell you this is such a special, special community, and I'm so honored to be part of it. So today I changed my title a little. I changed it to Food as Medicine for Human and Planetary Health. This is a topic that I'm very, very passionate about, and I'm hoping to share some of these insights that I've learned with all of you today. I'm in the Division of Immunology, Rheumatology, and I'm proud to say I recently was board certified in lifestyle medicine. So here are my disclosures, and here is what I'd like to talk about in the next few minutes that we have together. I want to share a couple of recent examples where food and lifestyle medicine are really, truly, you know, um, super important for our health. I'm going to give you some background on climate change, health, and food, and why we should care. I want to talk about some of the health benefits of plant-based diets and answer some of the questions that I get from a lot of the patients that I see. And then finally, I want to end with talking about some strategies and resources, kind of practical tips to really try to promote more plant-based diets. And we'll end with a discussion. So I'm going to start. I'm a rheumatologist by training. I see a lot of patients with inflammatory diseases, with autoimmune diseases. Probably one of the most common conditions we see is rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis. And these are, again, degenerative, and some of them are inflammatory joint conditions. What I want to share with you are a couple of exciting randomized controlled trials that just came out about a year ago. One of them was a randomized trial on rheumatoid arthritis, and one was on osteoarthritis. And essentially, what the intervention was a lifestyle medicine approach. Whole food, plant-based diets. The patients received detailed weekly menus. They also were put through a lifestyle program involving, education about whole food, plant-based diets, exercise, stress reduction, cooking classes, physical therapy, guided exercises. And the results were striking. So for rheumatoid arthritis, you can appreciate this is called the disease activity score. They measure 28 swollen tender joints, and blue is the control, red are the plants for joints group. And you can appreciate that even by 8 weeks, they were seeing a statistically significant improvement in the rheumatoid arthritis patients, which was more pronounced in the seronegative RA group of patients. Similarly, when they did a similar controlled trial for osteoarthritis, which is again the most common form of arthritis, there was a quite profound reduction in joint symptoms. They looked at this WOMAC total score in pain, in stiffness, and function, and all of them hit their endpoints in the Plants for Joints lifestyle group. So this really demonstrated and underscores that food can be medicine, lifestyle medicine works. If that's not convincing enough to you, I want to share with you another study that came out by Dean Ornish's group last year. One of the things that I personally fear greatly is cognitive impairment, dementia, Alzheimer's disease. So this was a study where he looked at 51 patients with early Alzheimer's disease with mild cognitive impairment and randomized them to standard of care versus the lifestyle intervention, similar to what we talked about with a whole food, minimally processed, plant-based vegan diet. They provided meals for this study. They did aerobic activity, 30 minutes a day with some mild strength training, stress management, different interventions, group support sessions, and supplements. And what they found after just 20 short weeks is they were able to see improvements in several key clinical endpoints: clinical global impression of change, highly statistically significant improvement; clinical dementia rating global, also highly statistically significant; and then an objective measure, amyloid beta 42/40 ratio, was also improved. So it was very exciting to see that even in 20 short weeks, doing a holistic lifestyle intervention with a whole food, minimally processed plant-based diet could have a significant impact. So I'm hoping that that has inspired you. I actually now am starting to call whole food plant-based diets an anti-dementia diet. As Hippocrates told us many, many years ago, let food be thy medicine. So keeping that in mind, let's talk a little bit about climate change, health, and food, and let's discuss why we should care about this. So as the WHO and the Lancet have said, climate change is the greatest threat to the global health, to global health of the 21st century. I think all of us can agree that we're seeing more and more frequent extreme weather events of wildfires, droughts, desertification, hurricanes, 2 in a row that hit Florida last year. And the past 10 years have been the 10 hottest years on record. We're clearly entering a climate crisis that has we need to address this urgently. I want to try to convince you that, climate change and health are extremely interconnected. And this is something that we are seeing as physicians in our practices. With air pollution, which gets worse with our increasing heat, we're seeing, worsening impacts on a lot of the cardiovascular respiratory diseases. We're seeing increasing allergic diseases. You can imagine with these, there's longer growing seasons, more pollens in the air. We know that we're having more days of extreme heat, and unfortunately, this just disproportionately affects those at the extremes of age, the very young and the very old. We're seeing more issues with drought, which has a lot of impacts, environmental degradation leading to forced migration. I don't know how many of you are in California, but Los Angeles just underwent one of the worst wildfires and urban fires ever seen. And what really, really saddens me is the fact that this leads to degraded living conditions, social inequities are impacted. It is the people who have contributed the least to climate change that stand to be impacted the most. And that is what really, really makes me sad. In terms of changes in vector ecology, I think it's important to recognize that we are seeing increases in infectious disease. Lyme disease is starting to spread, dengue, West Nile, a lot of these different diseases that were thought to be more tropical are now becoming more common even here in North America. Food system impacts is something I'm highly concerned about. Malnutrition, food insecurity, foodborne illnesses that are going up. Severe weather and floods are a problem, and of course, water quality impacts. So, all of these things are highly related to climate change and health. And we haven't even started to talk about the mental impacts that this imposes in terms of eco anxiety. So, we all, I think, really we need to unite on the front of really trying to get at climate change. And I think one thing that may not be widely appreciated is that food is actually responsible for anywhere from a quarter to a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. For those of you who are not familiar, I recommend you check out the website called Project Drawdown at drawdown.org, based on a book by Paul Hawken. It really nicely lays out all the different sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and importantly, it provides solutions. What are the top solutions that we can do, that we can employ to try to manage the greenhouse gas problem? This is a dramatic slide that I got from Patrick Brown from Stanford, and it really shows that animal agriculture, exploits 45% of the Earth's ice-free land surface. And what's even more striking is animal agriculture accounts for more than 80% of humanity's total land footprint. What's even more striking than that is when you think about animal agriculture, it only accounts for 17% of our global calorie supply and 38% of our global protein supply. So the bottom line here is that animal agriculture is a very inefficient way of feeding the world, and we're going to need to really rethink these strategies. One of the reasons this is so problematic is that the footprint continues to expand from animal agriculture. In fact, a lot of our beef comes from Brazil, from the Amazon, and deforestation. We're now seeing more than 90% of Amazon deforestation related to animal agriculture. They're literally burning the forest in order to create land for cattle ranchers or for growing soybeans to feed the cattle. So you can think of this as secondhand smoke from your steak. And so I think it's important to be familiar with, what are the greenhouse emissions of different food sources. I love Our World in Data. This is a fantastic website, lots of really informative graphs. And what you can easily appreciate by looking at this graph is that by far and away, beef outstrips everything else when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein, as compared to grains and other protein sources like tofu, soybeans, nuts, pulses, etc. And so this is really quite dramatic. I'm going to show you a different graph where this is another another graph from Our World in Data showing greenhouse gas emissions across the supply chain. And I'm going to zoom in on beef yet again. What you can appreciate is that the reason the greenhouse gas footprint of beef is so disproportionate is because there's the land use impact, so the deforestation that we just talked about. There's also a lot of methane emissions. So those burps from the ruminants that are eating grass, they are leading to methane emission, which is up to 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. There's also a lot of emissions from fertilizer. So all of the crops that are grown, like soybeans, to feed the beef, to feed the cattle, also lead to greenhouse gas emissions. And you can appreciate that transportation really provides a very small contribution to the greenhouse gas footprint. So I think it's pretty clear from this graph that beef, for sure, is one of the biggest offenders when it comes to animal agriculture. And again, all of these other plant-based sources are much lower in terms of their greenhouse gas footprint. I get asked by my patients a lot about, well, what about grass-fed cattle? Isn't that better? So the answer to that is it's better probably from an animal welfare perspective. There may be a little bit more nutritious value, but unfortunately, this is not better for the environment. And the rationale for that is because it turns out these grass-fed cattle require lots of land to graze. They grow a lot more slowly, and therefore you can imagine the amount of methane they generate occurs over a longer period of time. So the area under that curve still is quite substantial. In fact, some say even more than the factory farmed beef. So that's important to note. Another environmental impact besides greenhouse gases we should be thinking about is water. And water, again, some of us, many of us probably live in California, and this is a huge concern that we have. And it turns out that beef, yet again, takes 15,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of food. Nuts can be also quite thirsty for water. And here we have other meats that are quite water intensive. But again, looking at fruits and vegetables down here and other cereals, you cannot make the comparison is quite clear. It's important to bring up, where we're getting our food from and our animal-based food from. And I think it's, important to be aware of concentrated animal feeding operations. I'm showing you a few pictures here, and you can appreciate just how crowded the living spaces are. These conditions are inhumane, and they breed a lot of disease, a lot of infections, things like that. I'm going to show you a little more. And so when we think about factory farms, it turns out that more than 10 billion farm animals are slaughtered for food each year in the United States. Over 95% of the animals that we eat come from factory farms. The entire factory farming system creates 13-fold as much waste as the entire US population. It's incredibly wasteful. And you can imagine a lot of this waste ends up getting into our groundwater. And that can lead to something called toxic algal blooms. So this is basically runoff that is rich in nitrogens and other things that basically flows into the Mississippi, flows out to the Gulf of Mexico or America. Don't want to say that. And it can create these areas of runoff that are called dead zones, where essentially what happens is these nitrogenous waste feed a lot of the algae. They overgrow, it's called a toxic bloom, and they end up using up all the oxygen in the water so that there are no fish or other sea creatures that can live in these areas. So this is really, and this area of this dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is the landmass of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. It's huge. Additional environmental impacts to mention. So I'm showing you a picture of these CAFOs. These are the concentrated animal feeding operations we talked about. They basically flush out all of the waste into these lagoons that are deep red. This is a lot of blood and other excrement, things like that. These lagoons end up decomposing and they release a lot of toxins and greenhouse gases, including methane, into the air, causing air pollution. So when you drive down Highway 5 in California, the Central Valley, you'll often get whiffs of these smells. And it turns out that would be from a lot of these lagoons that are giving off these horrible stenches. You can imagine that also can lead to things. So these are highly nitrogenous waste sources. And a lot of times they'll use this water to spray on neighboring crops. And then that can end up leading to food contamination. So when you hear about, outbreaks in different vegetables, for example, it's not the vegetable's fault. It's because of the animal agriculture next to the farm that's leading to spread of a lot of these bacteria. In addition, something that I think needs to be understood is that these animals are getting fed antibiotics. And the problem is that that can breed antibiotic resistance, which is something that frightens all of it, should frighten all of us. It turns out 80% of the antibiotics we use are not for humans, they're for animals. And this is a huge problem that we are concerned about in terms of looming threats. And then here we are coming from a pandemic and we're watching bird flu grow. So this really does set the stage for future pandemics. So I think The Guardian had a nice piece that the headline was the key message, which is that avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way for us to reduce our impact on Earth. I'm going to switch to a positive, more exciting positive topic, which is the health benefits of plant-based diets. And the way I look at this is I kind of cast a large umbrella. I like to think of diets as sustainable, which are really plant-rich dietary patterns. And you can appreciate that along the scale of from vegan, which is zero animal products, to a healthy Mediterranean diet. These are all really plant-rich, plant-based dietary patterns, but the environmental impact is clearly the lowest when you are fully vegan or more vegetarian. That's important to keep in mind. I think people may be aware, but dietary risks have now surpassed tobacco as the number one cause of death, not only in the US, but also globally. Here's our standard American diet. This may look familiar to many of us. We're eating a lot of pizza, a lot of burgers, a lot of fries, a lot of processed foods. And based on the dietary guidelines for America, I think it's shocking to see when you look at the percent who consume the daily minimum amounts of fruits and vegetables, it's 12% of us, of adults and 10% consuming fruit and vegetables at the recommended amounts, and it's single digits for adolescents. So clearly we have a huge problem in terms of the quality of the diets in the American, based on too many people eating this standard American diet. And it turns out that our standard American diets, we're calling these the SAD diet. These are high in ultra-processed foods, high in animal products. Unfortunately, they are highly inflammatory and drive a lot of disease. I'm going to show you these graphs. This is from the US Department of Agriculture. Over the years, from the turn of the century, this shows what has happened to the per person, per capita meat intake over time. We are now eating close to 200 pounds of meat a year, which is striking. This is the graph showing what's happened with how much chicken we're eating a year, almost 64 pounds. And here's what's happening with our cheese intake. And I'm highly concerned about the slopes of these curves that are just going up and up. It's very clear that plant-based diets are good for the planet. And here is a nice graph that shows that if you were to go vegan for 2/3 of your meals, you would cut your carbon emissions by 60%. And going 100% vegan, you would cut your emissions by 85%. This is really quite striking. Another graph that I like to show is if you look at the relative risk of mortality on the y-axis and the average relative environmental impact on the x-axis and the y-axis here, you can appreciate that unprocessed red meat and processed red meat are both bad for mortality, bad for your health, and bad for the environment, whereas a lot of these things lower on the food chain are good for your health and obviously better for the environment. I want to just remind people, I'm not sure how widely known it is, but the World Health Organization has stated that in fact, processed meat is considered a group 1 carcinogen. So we're talking about hot dogs, ham, sausages, corned beef, jerky, canned meat. There is sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity in humans and strong associations with colorectal cancer. Similarly, red meat in general has been considered a group 2A carcinogen. So there's not, again, I think there's growing evidence of the link with colorectal cancer, but there's very strong mechanistic evidence for these products being carcinogenic. I get asked the question a lot, well, what about plant-based meats? And so again, going to Our World in Data, they have a very nice graph, and it shows if you look at comparing to beef, Beyond Meat, Impossible Meat, and tofu here all have about a 36-fold lower carbon footprint compared to beef. So this is a great stepping stone towards moving towards a more plant-based diet. If you're craving that burger, you're craving, that ground meat, it's again, this is a very reasonable option. People ask me, well, is it healthy? So the answer I provide is if you can, there's a study by Christopher Gardner's group called Swap Meat. And this was a very rigorously done randomized crossover comparison of meat. So people were allowed to eat any meat versus plant-based meat. And what he showed over a short period of time is that looking at biomarkers of cardiovascular health, such as like LDL cholesterol, there was a clear improvement in the patient in the participants who ate plant-based meat compared to regular meat. So even in a short period of time, these biomarkers improved. It turns out plant-based meats, unlike regular meat, they have fiber, other nutrients, and equivalent protein as meat. They do not have cholesterol. They do not have antibiotics. So there's a lot of good things about plant-based meat. A question that we're asking is perhaps they may also have fewer other pollutants like persistent organic pollutants. And that's another thing that I'm interested in looking at. Okay, so let's talk briefly about some of these cohort studies. The Adventist Health Study, this is a prospective cohort study of Adventists. These are people that live very healthy lifestyles, and there's over 100,000 participants that have been followed for many, many years. And the key findings of these studies were that vegetarians, compared to meat eaters, had a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, of hypertension, of hyperlipidemia, diabetes, several cancers, and degenerative arthritis. When they looked at these large groups of participants, almost all risk factors and disease incidences were further improved when they looked at the subgroup that had a vegan diet compared to the ovo-lacto vegetarian diet. So this is quite strong data supporting a plant-based diet pattern. From that Adventist health study, what I'm going to show you is they also looked at different dietary patterns, and you can appreciate that body mass index decreased proportion just as you went from a non-vegetarian dietary pattern to semi-pesco-vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, and the vegans were the ones who had the lowest body mass index. In fact, this is considered normal. Anything above 25 is considered overweight. So, and then the prevalence of type 2 diabetes, I thought this was also very striking. Going from non-vegetarian to vegan or vegetarian, the prevalence of diabetes decreased quite dramatically. I love to talk about the blue zones because you're never going to run a randomized controlled dietary study for 100 years. And the blue zones are 5 different regions of the world, including one here, Southern California, Loma Linda. This is where the Adventists live. But 5 regions where they have found the highest concentration of centenarians, of the people living to be over 100 years old. And what they found is their diets were 95 to 100% plant-based. Let me show you what their diet looks like. So here's the Blue Zone's dietary food pyramid. And they were very much whole ingredients, minimal processed foods. One thing that all 5 Blue Zones had in common is every group of these people ate about 1/2 to 1 cup of beans a day. This is a fantastic source of proteins as well as fiber. They drank mostly water, not sugary drinks. They had nuts, a couple of handfuls a day. And then weekly, they really limited their refined sugar. Eggs were quite limited. Fish was also limited. And then monthly, they very much limited their meat intake to less than 5 times a month. So really this equates to maybe once a week. Same thing for dairy products. So this was a very heavily plant-based dietary pattern. I can just go on and on about all the health benefits of whole food plant-based diets, but I don't have enough time. But there's so much data supporting decreases in all-cause mortality, weight loss we talked about, favorable changes in lipid profiles. There's been evidence for decreased risk and even reversal. I'm going to repeat that, even reversal of cardiovascular disease, which is really striking. Decreased risk of several cancers, decreased risk of diabetes, improving glycemic control. Even migraines got better. And I'm going to give a shout out to Christopher Gardner, who created this incredible Netflix series called You Are What You Eat. He did a study on genetically identical twins, randomized one to a healthy omnivore diet and one to a healthy vegan diet. And lots of cool studies, cool results from that study. But in fact, it was even shown that aging was slower on the vegan diet, which I thought was striking. Numerous other benefits, more and more studies coming out regularly. So let's take a moment to sing the praises of fiber. Fiber is something that is only found in plants, and fiber is something that our standard American diets are highly deficient in. The average American is only getting about 15 grams of fiber a day or less, and the recommendations are we try to get closer to 30 grams of fiber or more. There are so many benefits of fiber, I cannot even tell you. It increases our satiety without extra calories, and so it helps us feel full, so we tend not to overeat. Whole grain fiber increases our metabolic rate. It actually even promotes the loss of calories in our stool. It's a great weight loss regimen. It improves our gut motility, prevents constipation. It's important that, we're learning more about the microbiome, and fiber is really key to promoting a beneficial gut microbiome, leading to the production of these healthy things called short chain fatty acids. It improves our blood sugar response to food. So it really helps in terms of minimizing blood sugar spikes that happen when we eat, carbohydrates. And of course, it's associated with healthy, reduces our risk for heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. And so you can imagine if you ate like, 4 or 5 of these things a day that I'm showing you here, you would easily meet your target amount of fiber. One other thing that I'm very interested in learning more about is, can fiber help us with a lot of the toxins that are in our environment, in our water, in our food, in our air? And we're learning more about forever chemicals, PFAS. There's been a lot of different diseases that are associated with increasing body load of PFAS that I'm just showing you right here. And a very intriguing study showed that when they looked at people's mean fiber intake by different quartiles, you can see there was a dose response in terms of lower amount of PFAS in the body of people who had higher fiber diets. So again, I think more to come on this, but I think this is also a compelling reason to really increase our amount of fiber in our diets. A big question that I get asked by my patients all the time is, well, how am I going to get enough protein? So the average individual, we need about zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram or 0.36 grams of protein per pound. So for a 150-pound sedentary person, that equates to about 54 grams a day. There may be slightly increased needs if we're older, if we're pregnant, if we're performance athletes, or if we're children. But really, it's not far from these target amounts. And you can imagine that you can easily achieve this amount of protein by eating a variety of different plants. And the good news is that plants contain fiber, antioxidants, phytonutrients, in comparison to animal proteins that contain saturated fat and cholesterol. I want to point out that beans are a particularly good source of protein, as are tofu, tempeh, things like this. So keep that in mind. And again, lots of health benefits for eating plants. One thing I like to show is when you look at amino acids, this is a busy graph that shows 20. So here's the 9 essential amino acids on the left, and look across animal foods versus plant foods below here. And they're actually pretty similar distributions. The key thing I'm going to point out is that plants really do have all the essential and non-essential amino acids. It's just that plants, legumes in particular, may have a little bit less methionine, and it turns out that some of the grains may have a little bit less lysine. They're not deficient, but they have a little less. However, if you eat combinations of these foods, which most of us do, you will easily have plenty of amino acids to have a complete protein. So that argument of, oh, plants are incomplete is really not a very cogent argument to make. I recommend to all my patients, if we can swap out refined grains, all the white bread, white pasta, white rice, and try to incorporate more whole grains listed here. These are much healthier, contain a lot more fiber. Also, I encourage people to really start to increase more of their, omega-3 fatty acid intake by things like chia seeds and flax seeds and walnuts, and increase your intake of fermented foods, which are really, really good for your microbiome. If you go 100% plant-based, I would recommend taking a vitamin B12 supplement. If you're fully vegan or even, vegetarian, I take a multivitamin, I take a supplement. Even people that are elderly should be supplementing with vitamin B12. or if you're on a proton pump inhibitor, or if you're diabetic and you're on metformin, these people should all be taking more B12. Keep in mind, pay attention to making sure you're getting enough omega-3, calcium, vitamin D, iron, and zinc. But my point is that if you are just eating your standard American diet, you're omnivorous, a lot of those people are deficient in fiber or a lot of other of our vitamins, calcium, mag, potassium, folate. So I would argue that a lot of plant-based diets, if they're well planned, have no issues with deficiency. You just do need to supplement with B12. And of course, remember, try to limit ultra processed foods. So, corn turning into canned corn that's processed can turn into corn chips that's ultra processed. These are the things we want to try to limit in our diets. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Michael Pollan's words of wisdom. I want to just now end with some strategies and some resources to promote plant-based diets. One thing that I'm very much an advocate of is that we as physicians are very powerful, and the unfortunate problem in medicine is there's been so much of a focus on treatment rather than on prevention of disease. Our reimbursement system for medical care is focused on medical treatments, medical procedures. We don't have time for nutrition counseling. In fact, one study showed that only 12% of our office visits had any counseling about diets, which is a huge problem. Nutrition and lifestyle medicine are not emphasized in our medical curriculum. And so only 27% of medical schools provide the minimum 25 hours of nutrition education. Only 14% of residents think they even possess the knowledge or the training to provide nutritional counseling. This was from the Food Insight Survey, showing that among the potential sources of food information, it turns out the most trusted people behind food and nutrition scientists are medical doctors and nurses. And this is even above registered dietitians and government and chefs. So it's really striking. We are very fortunate that we're trusted, but we need to be educated. So my big area of focus is clinicians can make an enormous impact. And so here's a thought experiment. Imagine if the typical physician has a patient panel of 1,000 people eating 3 meals a day. If you do the math, potential to influence over 1 million meals a year. The good news is most patients are eager to eat sustainably. 59% say sustainability is important. And 78% have stated that they've changed their eating habits as a result of conversations with their physician. And I can personally attest to this happening for me. A website I want to encourage all of you to check out is plateforplanet.org. I send all my patients to this. It's a quick 10-minute video showing why sustainable eating is so important. And one of the slides from this module shows that a serving of red meat generates 180 full times more greenhouse gas than a serving of beans. So I want to share with you the study that we've done called the Plant Study, providers learning about nutrition together in collaboration with my wonderful co-investigators, Doctors Neha Shah and Miriam Makowski. And this was a study where we hypothesized that healthcare professionals exposed to a 6-week nutrition education intervention on whole food plant-based diets would be more likely to adopt a whole food plant-based diet themselves, and more importantly, feel more confident in recommending it to their patients. So we were aimed to recruit 100 healthcare providers randomized to either the early intervention or the late intervention. We took our primary endpoint at week 6, and we did surveys every 3 weeks. And the top line from this is we were able to very easily recruit 102 healthcare providers at Stanford. These were mostly doctors, several advanced practice providers. They completed the 6-week intervention. This included a couple of cooking classes as well as didactic lectures. And we have very exciting results to report, which is we saw a very significant increase in Group A at week 6, their readiness to change to a whole food plant-based diet, as well as their level of confidence in discussing this with their patients in the early intervention group. And so our next steps are we're very excited to scale this to a broader, more diverse set of providers and really start to create more educational resources for providers and patients so that we can really spread the word to our providers who can then spread the word to our patients. So let me just I'm going to end with some quick tips and tricks for how we can shift towards a more plant-based diet. I think it's important to really focus not on what you're giving up, But focus on what you're adding. Really think about all the yummy plant foods that we can be incorporating into our diet. And one thing that this does is this tends to then crowd out a lot of the animal-based foods in our diet. Think about making some swaps that are barely noticeable. So, moving from dairy milk to plant-based milk is an easy one where you can easily just swap out, soy milk or oat milk in your cereal in the morning. Um, it's great to try to recreate favorite meals to feature plant-based ingredients. So, for example, trying Impossible or trying Beyond Beef in terms of making a plant-based burger. Or if you're going to make spaghetti with ground beef in it, there's a lot of great, plant-based ground beef options you can swap out. Start one meal at a time. So, really, baby steps. For someone who normally eats bacon and eggs for breakfast, think about let's swap that out for oatmeal and berries and nuts and plant-based milk. And you've got a very protein-rich breakfast right there. Things like Meatless Monday, plant-based at home, a lot of these types of strategies, but just think about incremental steps you can or that you can take to shifting towards more plant-based eating. So, final thoughts I want to share with you is that really we all can help fight this epidemic of chronic diseases that we're seeing by choosing to eat a more whole food plant-based diet. And the real high level take homes are remember a lot of great healthy plant proteins, legumes, nuts, seeds. These should be emphasized. Animal products should be limited as much as we're able. Fiber, I mentioned, is really important, and that is something we should be trying to ramp up. It's important for so many health related reasons. It's great for maintaining a healthy gut microbiome. Whole grains should be prioritized over refined grains. Ultra processed foods should be really limited as much as we're able to. And I just want to remind everyone, we vote with our forks and our spoons every day. My husband didn't like having a globe being stabbed by a fork, so I put a spoon here instead. And importantly, I think we can easily try to eat a more sustainable whole food plant-based diet, knowing it's good for our own health and good for the planet, and spread the good word. So I want to end with a quote from Jonathan Safran Foer. He has a book called We Are the Weather: Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast. And he writes, changing how we eat will not be enough on its own to save the planet, but we cannot save the planet without changing how we eat. And with that, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to really thank my patients who've taught me so much, my wonderful colleagues who helped with the plant study, Christopher Gardner, who's been a wonderful colleague, friend, and mentor, and his team, my friends, family, colleagues. And again, I want to thank all of you for joining this morning and for being here. And with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention, and let's take questions. And feel free to reach out to me directly. Here's my email. Feel free to copy that down. But I would love to hear from you and engage in any discussions that you may have. And with that, I'm going to stop. Yes, so I'll stop sharing. And
Thank you so much, Tamiko. That was fascinating. And as a vegetarian myself, there's music to my ears. But I do have a question of my own, and I see many other questions on the chat line. So you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there was a study where in 20 weeks, based on some lifestyle changes, including exercise and diet, you saw significant improvements. Uh, how much of that do you think was attributed to like Alzheimer's, prevention, was attributed to exercise versus diet?
I think that is such a great question. And I mean, I'm trying to remember if I'm not an Alzheimer's expert, so I'm going to start with that. But I think, what I love about these lifestyle interventions is that they are multimodal. So if you reduce it to just exercise, I wonder if you did just an exercise trial for Alzheimer's, my guess is you wouldn't get this dramatic result. And
Right.
so what I love is the fact that they used all six pillars of lifestyle medicine. And in doing this very holistic intervention, they were able to see change. So, trying to kind of rank order what was the most impactful, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
For the Plants for Joint study, they did some sensitivity analysis, and it did suggest that the food was one of the biggest movers of the needle. But again, I think we need to be thinking about doing more trials of lifestyle medicine, all six pillars involved.
There's a question about calcium supplements for vegan people. What do you think?
I think it's reasonable. I mean, there's a lot of plant-based milks that are fortified with calcium. I do take a calcium supplement. I think there's a lot of calcium in things like kale and, various other sources. But I think it's reasonable to take a calcium supplement if you have any concerns that you may not be getting enough. And working with a dietitian is always helpful just to make sure you're meeting, your macros and also the micronutrients as well.
Right. There's a question about India, and there's a sizable population that's vegetarian. I don't know the numbers, but there is. But it still has a high rate of heart disease and diabetes. So just being vegetarian by itself is not sufficient, I suppose.
Yes, it's so interesting you bring up India. I've been thinking a lot about Asia and I think it's so complicated because I agree. I mean, the Indian diet, if it's vegetarian, if it's vegan, that would be probably even, well, a step further towards more, well, it depends. There's unhealthy vegan, there's healthy vegan, right? And so that's the key. I worry about India in terms of, is there a lot of pollution that may be playing in and other sources of contaminants? One thing I'm particularly interested in is understanding how a lot of these industrial chemicals and things may be playing into disease manifestations. A lot of these have been termed endocrine disruptors, obesogens, diabetogens. And so that's why I actually do think that fiber can be also super helpful because I think we're seeing more and more data that it may help us to rid ourselves of a lot of these toxins that are driving disease and inflammation.
So, a question about dining halls at Stanford. I don't know if you would be in a position to answer it, but is any of your studies that you have done influencing what is being served to students?
So I work very closely with Christopher Gardner, who has very much been working with what's called the Menus of Change program. And they have been trying to really shift things. They're doing something called the protein flip, where they're making protein more of a condiment, less of a main dish. So I know there's a lot of movement in terms of trying to make the Stanford Dining Hall much more plant forward. So yes, I mean, I'm not directly involved, although I'm actually on a grant where we're going to try to also delve into to moving things in institutional food systems that direction. That's
Okay.
super important.
Okay. And there's a question on almonds. Is almond and almond milk also harmful to the environment, or what do you think, compared to other forms of vegetarian food?
Right. Almond milk compared to like soy or oat milk, I can say that it's tricky, and food is such a tricky thing, right? Everything's so nuanced. Almonds, as many people probably know, can be very water intensive. And so I do worry about that. And so I tend to shy away from it for that reason. I don't know if there's any studies that show almond is better than soy versus oat. I do tend to kind of use soy and oat mainly as my sources of plant-based milks, though.
And you mentioned Impossible Meat and Beyond Meat, and while they are vegan, are they also, would you consider them highly processed or no?
So that I knew that question would come up. Thank you for asking it. Um, the field of processed and ultra processed food remains very controversial and confusing. Um, and I'm waiting for Christopher Gardner, who he's going to have. I think he's got a publication that's in the works, trying to answer this because there's a classification called the NOVA classification where there's four different levels of processing, whole food, very minimally. So there's different levels. A lot of food gets lumped into the number four category, which means ultra processed. It turns out that plant-based meat like Impossible or Beyond is not the same thing as eating a Twinkie or eating, candy or drinking a soda, right? Like so I think that there's so much more nuance with processed food, and I should say ultra processed food, that I feel like we're lumping things into that bucket when in fact we don't necessarily have all the data to support the healthful or unhealthfulness of those different foods. So I personally think that, from a plant-based meat perspective, the goal is not to eat that every day and gorge on it. but I think it's a wonderful stepping stone if you are trying to move in the direction of becoming more plant-based. Having occasionally a bit of a, an Impossible Burger is a better environmental choice for sure. And I think Christopher's swap meat study provided some very compelling data from a cardiovascular risk factor. It is a better choice in terms of your cholesterol and your LDL cholesterol, things like that going down.
Okay. And a question on avoiding canned foods. What would be the most important reasons for that?
Avoiding canned. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So people are probably familiar with a lot of canned food having BPA. This is one of the, um, chemicals that is thought to be what's called an endocrine disruptor. Again, not there's a lot of companies that are moving away from BPA linings in canned food. So I would say occasionally, I think a lot of the organic canned food may not have BPA linings, and so I would say it's all about dose, right? And I would say frozen food is a better way to go. I love telling my patients, especially those that may not have ready access to fresh vegetables and fresh fruits and produce, saying that frozen actually retains a lot of the nutrient value. They get flash frozen on the spot at the height of their ripeness, and so a lot of their wonderful phytochemicals, phytonutrients are all preserved. So that's, I think, a good alternative over canned. But obviously, if you have to go with canned, it's an option that's reasonable.
Okay. And what is your opinion on the dangers of lectins in oatmeal, almonds, and other seemingly healthy food?
So the lectin argument, I think, has been a little misplaced. I think that lectins in general break down with cooking. So if you were going to go out there and eat a bunch of raw beans, like, raw black beans, like no one no one does that, right? So I think that we need to be cautious when we're listening to all these influencers. There's a guy named Carnivore MD that goes out there and says just eat meat, and I'm just kind of face palming going, really? And so I think that, and I do know the lectin person as well. I know who that person is. So keep in mind that it's all about, the lectins get cooked and degraded, and it's really an issue if you're eating raw lectins, which really we don't tend to do.
Okay. So here's an interesting one. Every time I try to go vegan, I feel hungry. There are only so many beans I could stand. Where can I get recipes for meals that are satiating?
So yeah. So I would say, Forks Over Knives is one of the websites that is kind of has a lot of recipes, also has a lot of kind of the information about, health benefits and things like that. Um, I recommend my patients go to Plant-Based on a Budget, which is again for people that may not have easy access. There's actually a lot of great plant-based recipe websites. So yeah, I think that, again, I know everyone thinks, oh, I'm not satiated. I mean, I would say try to ramp up your fiber and again with the protein with beans and other sources. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think fiber is a good one, right? To keep feel satiated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another question on Stanford food. The son is vegan and finds many of, oh, this is a good one. Finds many of the vegetarian items inedible, he says. So I don't know what we can do about food that's served to students because who are actually vegan or vegetarian. Is there something that is being done?
Did you say he finds the food inedible? Is that what you said?
Yes, he says the vegetarian items are inedible.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, it's tricky. I think
Yeah.
that you know, there's obviously, so I'll tell you this, there's not a one size fits all when it comes to diet. I think that people's personal preferences, I think we are learning that a lot of our, young kids especially, I mean, there's so much processed food which has been manufactured to be hyper palatable. And so we've created these addictions to a lot of these, hyper processed things, ultra processed things. And so, the whole palatability is a tricky one. I will say there's a term that David Katz mention once called taste bud rehab. And I think as you start to eat more and more in a plant-based fashion, you start to crave less and less, a lot of these types of foods that are not as good for us. And so again, I don't have a good answer to the quote inedibility factor, but I think just trying to continue to push things, changing our microbiome, it takes kind of a gradual, introduction of different things. So yes, sorry that he
Yeah.
finds things inedible. I don't have a good answer to fixing that.
So question about breakfast, and apparently students who, they don't get up in time, they skip breakfast. What do you think of, is that not a good practice? What's your thought?
It's such a, again, very individual thing. I think many people are very familiar with hearing the intermittent fasting, research out there saying that trying to have a very limited period where you're eating is better. Um, I think everyone's body is so different in terms of what they need, what are their energy requirements? Do they need to kind of have a regular source of calories throughout the day, or can they go without eating? Um, I think, intermittent fasting often gets used in the context of, okay, losing weight. And I'm guessing, maybe a lot of these students are not trying to lose weight, right? But so I think it's individual for every person. But I think, yeah, I get it. I mean, the practicalities are always tricky, right? How do we eat quick meals that are convenient, easy, fast? So it's hard to
Mm.
balance the equation.
Yeah.
I get it.
The daughter is vegan but has persistently low iron stores, and I'm not sure it's totally safe to keep taking iron supplements. Any suggestions for that?
Iron supplements are a reasonable thing to do. I would get your iron checked, right? We can easily measure iron measures on blood testing. So, I mean, that's what I would recommend. Yeah.
Okay. And how much soya is safe to eat?
I don't know if this question is coming from the concern about it's interesting. Soy has been listed as a quote endocrine disruptor. I have a lot of issue with that because again, I think the issues when it comes to breast cancer, things like that, um, Asia eats a lot of soy and they have some of the lowest rates of breast cancer, right? Obesity is associated with breast cancer. A lot of these other endocrine disruptor pollutants have endocrine activity that may stimulate estrogen. So I put soy in the good category. And I think soy is something that, I try to encourage people to increase their intake of. I think that the data that soy is dangerous is really not, anything in excess can be a problem, but I think in moderation, it's not a problem at all.
Okay. And can you address the prevalence of Roundup in our groundwater and how it affects agriculture and our food sources in California?
Huh, such a great question. So Roundup has glyphosate in it. I think we are all becoming more and more aware and concerned about the use of a lot of these pesticides in our food supply. Um, it's so hard to know. One thing that I've heard a lot of my patients tell me is that they have a wheat sensitivity, so a gluten sensitivity.
Yeah.
And maybe that may not be officially, quote, celiac disease, where they have a true immunologic intolerance to it, but it may be because our wheat is sprayed down with a lot of this glyphosate right before it's harvested. And so the concentrations of glyphosate that we're getting are quite high. And then, of course, when you're eating a diet that's high in a lot of these refined grains, you're getting a lot of glyphosate in your food. So again, one of those things where I would recommend trying to go organic as much as you're able. And I think just yeah, because I too share concerns about the role of glyphosate. And I think it's something we're going to need to address.
Yeah. Well, we run out of time, but let's end on a positive note. So Suman Goyal says her son is vegan, but is able to find recipes online. He's a big eater, able to feel full. And she says, please look at companies who provide delivery of uncooked meals. And that's how he started, and he can make his own now. So that's great. Once again, thank you so much, Tamiko. It was really a thought-provoking presentation, one that is important to each one of us. Prevention, as you said, is much better than cure. And I do have some good news for you. You just earned yourself 2 jars of our famous Stanford Parents Club apricot jam, which I will get to you as soon as possible. And thank you once again for speaking to our parents.
Great. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure. Appreciate the honor. Okay.